What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? Niche the train disaster is something that reminds me how death.
Niche the train disaster is something that reminds me how death can come at any moment. A train with 51 wagons of sulfur, fertilizer, petrol and cotton wool somehow broke loose and rolled down the track about 20 kilometers until it derailed in the town of Qam, Iran. There were no humans on board. Chemical leaks ensued, and authorities tried to extinguish whatever fires broke out. At one point, the whole thing explodes. And it really explodes. The whole town of Qam is literally demolished. 3 nearby towns are badly damaged, and it was heard 70 kilometers away. The wreckage continued to explode for several days after. Around 300 people died, and more than that injured. An earthquake of 3.6 on Richter scale was produced. The 1904 Cincinnati Privy disaster. In 1904, 9 schoolgirls drowned in an outhouse after the floor collapsed. They literally drowned in human waste. I work at a maximum security prison and we have several inmates who are severely mentally ill. The ones that self-harm wear a Fitbit kind of thing to monitor heart rate. If there is a change we rush their room to stop whatever is happening. On top of this we also do visual inspections. On one round a coworker was doing cell checks and noticed this particular inmate had blood on their face but nothing came up on the monitors or anything. So he called to the inmates to ask if they were okay. The inmate had their eyes closed and just kept repeating, "It doesn't hurt." The inmate would not answer where the blood was from. We opened the cell to see what the situation was, and it turns out the inmate had plucked out both of their eyes and they were laying on the floor. The inmate's hour monitor never alerted and the inmate never screamed. Paramedics said the inmate's vitals were normal and the inmate was fully responsive. My friend's boss bought an Audi A4 convertible back when they were new and interesting. One of the talking points was the pop-up roll hoops that were hidden unless you rolled it. A few months after buying it, he got to test those roll hoops out as he lost control and skidded down a steep bank about 10 meters, 35 feet, deep. The roll hoops did their job, and he survived with just cuts and scratches from the bushes he plowed through. The car ended up the right way up, and he got out, walked back up the bank to the side of the road, then got on the phone to the police to report the accident. While he was standing there, a driver from a car that had seen the accident came over to speak to him. Approaching from behind, the other driver asked if he was okay. My friend's boss turned around to reply and dropped dead. His neck had been fractured, but was in one piece right up until he turned his head when it severed his spinal cord. My mom was driving and a guy ran out in the road, so she stopped so she couldn't hit him. It was nighttime, so it was pretty dark out, and 3 other men emerged from the forest around, all trying to use the door handles of her car to get in. She locked them luckily and gassed it to the nearest town. Remember to always lock your car after you start it, because if it wasn't unlocked, who knows what would have happened to her. Various torture murders are probably the most horrific things I've read about. Junko Furuta, who was a perfectly normal girl until she was kidnapped off the street by a gang for no reason, purely wrong place, wrong time, according to Japanese sources, and unimaginably raped and tortured to death over 44 days. Kiki Camarena, a D agent in Mexico, who was kidnapped by the Guadalajara cartel and tortured to death over about 3 days. His story is the central focus of the show Narcos, Mexico, but from what I've read, his death was even more brutal than what they make it out to be. A detail consistent in both is that they brought in a doctor to revive him numerous times when he got too close to death and keep him conscious so he couldn't pass out from the pain. Kellyanne Bates, who was groomed from a young age by a scumbag who eventually killed her slowly over the course of about a month in their apartment. Her injuries were so horrific the jury at the guy's trial had to get counseling. For example, her eyes were missing, and there were stab wounds in the sockets. Sylvia Likens, whose parents left her in the care of a woman who both personally and with the help of her children and their friends degraded, tortured, and killed over several months. The Hello Kitty murder in China, where a man and his about 13-year-old girlfriend kidnapped a prostitute who had supposedly stolen from him, even though sources say she had paid him back with interest, tortured her to death, and then stuffed her corpse into a Hello Kitty toy. Baby Brianna, a newborn whose mother, father, and uncle tortured and raped her from the second they brought her home from the hospital until the second she died. Baby P, a British toddler whose mother let her boyfriend torture him to death. His back was broken in his last days of life. Honestly, there are just so many horrifically on par with each other, you could list them all day. Artemis Pyle, the drummer from Lynyrd Skynyrd, survived a plane crash and walked to a nearby house, only to be shot by the homie Arwana. The homie Arwana saw a bloody long-haired man and winged him. Pyle survived that as well and made a full recovery. I would call it creepy more than scary, but my mom's friend had a small house and lived alone. She noticed weird things, a batch of soup depleting faster than usual, missing eggs, damp towels in the hamper when she hadn't used any, extra dishes in the dishwasher, etc. This went on for months. She thought she was just being forgetful. One day she heard some thumping around in her attic and went to investigate. She found some makeshift living quarters. Small radio, hot plate, sleeping bag, pillow, food wrappers, etc. She called the cops, who came to keep an eye on the place. They ended up catching a homeless man climbing a tree, trying to sneak into her attic window. He had been doing this almost daily. He would wait for her to go to work, then go downstairs and help himself to food and amenities. The funny part about this story is they got to know each other throughout the ordeal, and the guy was actually very respectful, just down on his luck. She didn't press charges, instead, let him move in, helped him get a job, and he lived in the attic until he got back on his feet. Creepy shit with a happy ending. When my aunt was about 16, she was working at a grocery store and had a boss in his mid-20s. One day he called the house and was begging her to sneak out and hang out with him. She was considering it because it was her boss and she didn't want to say no. My mom, who is 2 years younger than her, always gets these incredibly spot-on gut feelings. She had one that night and begged my aunt not to go out with him. Thankfully she listened to my mom and told him no, which made him really angry. He ended up going out that night and meeting another girl. He took her out to some cliffs and raped her and pushed her off. Somehow she lived through this and was able to get him sent to prison. I feel so sorry for that girl and so thankful for my mom and her gut feelings. Always trust your gut. Before my dad died, he once told me a story from when he was in Vietnam in the 1960s. He told me about a mission where he and one other American with 5 CIDG strikers, South Vietnamese villagers turned fighters, were tasked to emplace seismic ground sensors along a trail network deep in the jungle. He said they were about 2 days into the mission when he and 2 of the strikers split off from the main group to go watch a nearby trail intersection. He said the jungle was pretty quiet that day, just the sounds of birds and bugs and an occasional monkey. He said they had been watching the trail intersection for about 3 or 4 hours and were deciding on whether to move further down the trail or to turn back and link up with the rest of the patrol. Before leaving the cover of the brush, my dad said he checked the trail ahead of them one last time and prepared his men to move. Now here is where the story gets interesting, and he told this part with absolute dead seriousness. He said just as he started to step out onto the trail, he sees a light-skinned black Union cavalry soldier in full battle gear laying alongside the trail just shy of the intersection. My dad said the Union soldier had 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a short curved club at his hip. As my dad was trying to process what he was seeing, the soldier looked directly at him and smiled. Then the soldier slowly placed a finger up to his lips, as if to tell him to be silent, and then motioned my dad back off the trail. My dad said he signaled for his men to remain hidden, and he recalled that as he slipped back into the jungle on one side of the trail, the Union soldier did the same on his side of the trail. Less than 10 seconds later, he said the lead element of a group of NVA, North Vietnamese Army soldiers, walked right through the trail intersection some 30 feet away. My dad estimated that the group was comprised of some 70, 80 soldiers equipped with automatic rifles, light machine guns and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. He has no doubt that his entire team would have been wiped out on the spot. He said as soon as the enemy soldiers had passed, he and his team beat feet out of there as fast and as quietly as they could and rejoined with the rest of the patrol. He reported the enemy soldiers his team had encountered, but decided not to say anything about the soldier he had seen. My dad kept this secret for many years, only telling me just before he passed, and earlier only telling his grandmother on her deathbed in the 1970s. He said when he told his grandmother, she smiled and without opening her eyes told him, "You saw old Red Tom." Red Tom was my great-great-grandfather. He was a half black / half Creek freeman who was a scout for the Union Army during the Civil War and later served with the US Cavalry in the American West. He was known for carrying 2 pistols, a Spencer rifle and a Creek war club into battle. I worked for U-Haul when I was 18, and it was located in front of a club that was known for being really sketchy. I came in to open one morning, and it was common for people to knock on the door hoping to get in early and get their truck. On this day, I hear frantic knocking on the door. I'm there alone still, so it kind of startled me. I look and there's a woman, completely naked, covered in what looks like blood. I called the cops and grabbed one of the moving blankets and went outside to cover her up. She smelled really bad and was a mess. Ended up being blood and her own shit she was covered in. Found out later she was drugged at the club that night / early morning, raped and left, blacked out in the alley. It was just a fucked up and surreal situation to be involved in. I spent my first 10 years in New Delhi. Back then, we would find dead women, burnt with acid or set on fire, and it used to be so normal. Like, oh look, another one of those dowry cases, where her family didn't pay the husband enough money, so they killed her. Many years later I revisited those memories, and realized how insane that actually was. I'd totally forgotten about all that. This is from South Africa. The woman is called Alison Botha, and she was abducted, raped and then choked, until she blacked out. She was driven into a secluded area, stabbed 30 times in the abdomen and 16 times in the throat, and left for dead on the side of the road. She had to use her shirt to keep her organs inside her body and hold her head up because of a damaged muscle in her neck, and proceeded to crawl to the road, where she was eventually spotted and rescued. She survived the attack and now does motivational speaking, I believe. I was in a crappy motel, the room had bed bugs, I was too exhausted to go to the front desk, I just needed to make it until the morning. I slept in the tub. Hours later I hear someone breaking through the window. I had a big knife with me and ran out into the room to find a man halfway through my window. We stared for a while at each other in shock. I think we both were scared. Then he says, "Is this your room?" I'm like, "Yes, this is my room, man." More staring, then he slowly starts backing out while cursing me for leaving my window unlocked and not expecting him to break in. Motel on What RV, Sacramento. Old janitor from high school, friendly Ecuadorian man who went biping. Worked at the school for 20+ years and nobody had a problem with him. I guess his wife was leaving him and in the process of moving out, he caught her in bed with her new man. Next day, in the middle of town, he opened fire on her, the man, and then killed himself before any cops had time to respond. A guy I worked with was riding his dirt bike through the woods and somebody hung a cable between 2 trees. My buddy caught his throat on it and saw the dude steal his dirt bike. Woke up in the hospital with a lacerated throat and a broken larynx. Pretty crazy what somebody will do for something so cheap. My friend tripped and fell onto the tracks, landing his face onto the 3rd rail. We kinda stood there in absolute shock because we thought he was dead, but then he said, "Can I move? Will I be electrocuted?" We told him to move instantly and he did. We got him off the tracks, and no less than 2 minutes later a train went zipping by. I think the 3rd rail turned on seconds after his face came off of it. I know that's not scary to a lot of people, but to me, it was because I would have lost a close friend back when I was about 12. The story of Mary Vincent always stands out to me. In 1978, 15-year-old Mary was hitchhiking. A man named Lawrence Singleton picked her up. He brutally raped her and eventually made her get out of the car. She planned to run, but he noticed and cut both her arms off. He threw her into a ditch/ravine and left her to die. She packed her stumps with mud to stop the bleeding and spent all night crawling out. She eventually makes it to the highway and starts walking, naked and covered in blood. The first car that saw her sped away in fear. The second car was a couple on their honeymoon. They picked her up and she survived. Edited to @ I was in a rush when I wrote this, so you should definitely read more into the story. It's crazy. From the horrific act itself, to the court proceedings, to the fact that he hardly served any time. The case of Elizabeth Smart. She was kidnapped, repeatedly raped, psychologically tortured, and then brought around in plain sight in heavy religious garb. She had brushes with people who could have helped her, but her kidnapper claimed she wasn't allowed to speak in public or reveal her face for religious reasons. The reason she was rescued is because her sister was awake during her kidnapping and pretended to be asleep. She knew she recognized the voice, but it took her 9 months to remember. It was a guy that used to do yard work for the family. The police didn't believe her because of the elapsed time, but pursued it to appease the family. Nutty Putty Cave in Utah was sealed up in 2009 after John Jones was trapped upside down in a small crevice while spelunking. When rescue teams finally arrived, he had been upside down for so long that his legs were drained of blood. The only possible way to have gotten him out was to break his legs, which would have sent him into fatal shock. He died after being trapped for 28 hours. His body's still in the cave,